Am I audible and visible?
Yep, all good.
Okay. Panel, this debate is about the fact that in some of the most crucial areas of policy making, there's just a huge tyranny of not just blind majority, but of all the harms that comes with that kind of blind majoritarian rule. It leads to a lot of volatility. That means in critical areas like criminal justice system, where there's a systematic racism, where there's systematic bigotry, a lot of reforms need to happen, and a lot of these laws are actually like you have to go out and convince people that it's even worth it at the first place. Politicians are worst place to be making those decisions. Why do we think it will therefore work if appointed technocrats are doing it? Four things. I'll be starting with a mechanism about how this can potentially work, and then giving you three arguments as to why this is always more likely to be a superior option. Firstly, how does this work? I think this is not rocket science. Like, often these technocrats are the best and the brightest, and there's a very easy process to choose them, right? Like, they're doing research on these fields all the time. Presumably, someone who spent 5 years doing a PhD on like a lot of these really important topics in criminal justice system knows more than politicians who often probably don't even have like either empathy for a lot of people or as much expertise. Secondly, the fact that they know how to marry not just theory but with practice and innovation. Note that a lot of the most significant changes in our world, like look at this year, the COVID vaccine, it was literally created by people who are just like completely focused on the work, and that's why they're so good at it. What does that mean? It means they know how to marry practice, innovation, and theory at the same time. Thirdly, they're also data driven. But fourthly, it also means that there are checks and balances like any other institution, right? Like we can create these checks and balances. Note, in a comparative, therefore, they're just a lot more objective. Maybe it's not perfect, but they're just a lot more objective. But secondly, if something goes wrong, there's a reiterative process to right those wrong, as opposed to politicians where the discourse simply doesn't have that nature. Rather, it's a lot more populism based, which doesn't work out for positive change in the long run. How do we envision the world to look like under our side? We think it is likely to lead to laws in criminal justice system that are definitely a lot more progressive, right? So, for example, in places for example, European Union is prime example. The reason GDPR came out is because these laws are created by technocrats using the EU Commission's help. It's because the technocrats are at the edge of where the problems are. That's why they know how to come up with these solutions in the first place, because they're thinking about it, right? That's also why, for example, a lot of the countries that apply more pragmatic versions of like realism in criminal justice system are also places where technocrats get the policy making power. It means things like focusing on more rehab because that's just scientifically proven to be objectively superior in the long run and also in the short run if you know how to execute it right. Things like community centric policing as opposed to like violent policing, objectively proven to be like a superior option. But then we ask ourselves the question why these don't get scaled all over the world. But also progressive is relative. That means that we think this is likely to scale all over the world, i.e., it's not going to be the same, but it's definitely going to be better. What's the alternative under their side? They have to defend politicians coming in for short term, appointing short term political stooges, and how those people will be able to come up with better solutions. Now, the first reason why this is likely to work out is also because there's just a lot less bias and a lot less preconception orientation. What does that mean? Firstly, it means that politicians appeal to voter bases and they have to represent them. It's not about the facts, rather, it's about being able to convince enough people. Secondly, it's about the fact that a lot of the worst of communities never have the voting power necessary to hold politicians accountable and actually enact the right kinds of laws. That means these people are always going to be ignored. Thirdly, the fact that technocrats are not beholden to short-term needs to get reelected just means that they just don't have those incentives, right? But fourthly, look, the policy tradition, if you're a Democrat versus a Republican, is very monolithic. But if you're a technocrat and and a scholar, the policy tradition is actually a lot more nuanced, i.e., you may believe in a school of thought, but you also know that you often cross the aisle and there's an intersection, right? Like very different from debaters. That's basically what I'm talking about. This means that it's objectively superior because, on the other hand, politicians rely on Fox News and media and discourse and propaganda and even Facebook to create public opinions first and then apply it, as opposed to base policy making from facts ground up. Right.
Okay.
Fifthly, this also works because we are able to depoliticize and depolarize the criminal justice system. The problem with CJS right now is it's so polarized and politicized that everyone has to take a side. Like the guy who has absolutely no idea also has a policy opinion that's supposedly superior to someone who actually went through all that work. We get rid of that problem when technocrats are the ones deciding. Yes, Ron.
Mechanistic clarification, although I know that this is an analysis motion, it would be really helpful to know if you think these appointments are likely to happen so that politicians appoint them, or if they're appointed internally within these civil service bodies.
I mean, I think that's really difficult to answer. Of course, at some level, there's going to be politicians appointing them, but it's not going to be in a way where they can change things all the time, right? So it's really easy to find a balance. It will also just depend on the jurisdiction, right? So I think that's something that can be solved through a reiterative process anyway. Now, secondly, technocrats are also a lot more responsive to needs. What does that mean? It means that first, that their track records are a lot more based on what they have done, as opposed to politicians who may actually not even have any experience, but suddenly they get elected to Congress and they have the power to make decisions. Comparatively, we're far better positioned. Secondly, listen, technocrats are really good at their job because they're trained to listen first, i.e., understand the problem, as opposed to politicians who are trained to give an opinion that riles up enough people and gets enough people to vote for them. We think the shift in the dynamics from like dictating to listening, it just leads to better policy. Thirdly, technocrats work with evidence and work with outcome maximization, i.e., even if it's not always perfect, it's generally far superior. On the other hand, electoral politics is a lot more volatile. There is no long-term incentive, but also a lot of the politicians actually vote for conservative criminal justice policies because that's where the voters are from. It's because young people don't have a lot of voting power. The people who have the voting power are the people who are reminiscent of Reagan, or the people who are reminiscent of like the strictest penal codes in like all over Bangladesh or India. And these are the people who go to the vote bank every day and actually vote, as opposed to people like me. And that's just the sad reality. That's where they dictate the policy. Finally, technocrats are easier to hold more accountable for a couple of reasons. First, they are metrics oriented. What does that mean? It means if you're not able to reduce crime, you're just going to get fired, right? Because you're not performing well. If you're not reaching your goals, we're going to bring someone else who does it. Over time, that's just a lot more superior. But secondly, there's a lot more scrutiny on them. Supremely proud to propose.
Thank you very much, the Prime Minister. It's time for Leader of the Opposition to respond.
Cool. Before I start, can I be heard? Great. And also before I start, I'll take POIs in the chat. I know that's not revolutionary, but I thought I might say it anyway. Okay. I'm actually not sure that opening government understands their own case. Because on one hand, they say, we have facts and we have logic because we have technocrats that exist, completely ignoring the fact that facts and logic exist in the world of politics already. There are already senior policy advisors that do things like make policy recommendations to politicians. The difference between the two sides of this debate is not, do you have more facts? Do you have more logic? Can you make more common sense decisions? It is, are you going to put somebody who is unelected in a position where they can make absolute changes? That is, obviously, for a government side to hold any water, they have to circumvent processes that exist democratically. That is, technocratic policies cannot pass through things like Congress for the exact reasons that they give you. Specifically that, they run into deadlocks. Given that that is true, technocratic policies have to exist outside of the realm of the legislature. That is, technocrats need to make executive decisions. Here are the problems that opening government identifies with their own technocrats. First, they're immobile. That is, that they don't move as political regimes move, meaning that they don't reflect popular sentiment. Look to the issues with the Supreme Court in the US and how many problems they have with protecting like social progress. That abortion is even becoming a question is obviously ridiculous. Secondly, though, they they reduce the accountability that is on the politician at any given point in time. And I'll get to this in my first point of substantive in a moment. But one thing that I do want to say is that the fact that they gave a very flippant kind of like airy-fairy response to the POI that was asked by closing is important, because the fact that politicians can appoint technocrats specifically means that politicians can scapegoat technocrats to get around taking on political responsibility for things that they do wrong, for misgivings that they have. They can say, we're backed by facts, when they tell those technocrats exactly what to do. Because unlike the conception that opening government gives you, technocrats don't always know what is best. It is not that you know what is best and that's what makes you a technocrat. It's not that you read a book. It is that you know how the system works. That's why the privatization program of vouchers in Russia was fucking terrible and created the oligarchic class that you see now. That's why in 2011, the Greek economy continued to decline when they appointed technocrats to make the policies that they needed to, like, in that situation. That's why technocratic governments aren't hugely popular around the world. They make bad decisions. Firstly, though, on the principle, and I think that this is a round-winning argument, because absent all pragmatic impacts that any team can make, it comes back to the principle of democracy and the existence of a government that you elect. Why? First, societies do not have moral codes as states. They have them as individuals, and the state is the representation of the aggregate individual moral code. That is, people decide what they do and do not want as their criminal legislation. Why? Because when crimes are committed, they're committed against society, not against a particular person, but against the very fabric of the contract that the society has entered into for its own protection. That means that society, particularly when it comes to minorities, is far better and more affirmative in their protection, because technocrats famously support things like predictive policing. Latanya Sweeney, for example, at Harvard, is a really good example of a professor that supports or that has conversations on predictive policing, right? Given that these ideas that are often radical, as opening government wants to tell you about, enter the public discourse, there are a few harms. First, the radical ideas that technocrats have are often bad. The war on drugs was an idea that a technocrat had. Broken windows policing came from academia as an ideology that maybe it would fix cities. Every problem that you've seen in the criminal justice system as a large-scale movement against where criminal justice reform has not worked has more than likely originated from academic roots. Why? Because they don't have any contact with actual people. Research is devoid from human interaction to a tremendous extent. What does this mean for the principle, though? Ultimately, we think that democratic representation is the most important thing. It is the most direct way that you can represent and aggregate preferences, because you're actively able to represent what those preferences are to individuals who understand you and who can represent your interests. You fail to have any check back at all at the point at which you have technocrats, because the people who appoint technocrats are the people in government, and if they are appointed inflexibly, as the opening government team seems to think that they are, that means that you don't get any progressive changes happening in their criminal justice system. But more importantly, you become clientelist, because as that technocrat, you want to maintain your power in that job that you have. You want to maintain the absolute authority that you have in that job. To the extent that that is true, you also become liable to the political interests of the person in power. And note that this is particularly true for weaker democracies, because you can look at Australia and the US all you like, but this debate happens both there and in countries, like Ukraine, like Belarus, right? All of these countries also have their own civil political procedures, but the technocrats that you would appoint there would be hugely problematic. Why? Well, firstly, the governments are shadow democratic governments, but they still have elections that prevent obviously problematic legislation from passing, because they still have some semblance of an opposition. The problem with the appointed technocrat is they can override any democratic opposition that would prevent the passage of legislation that is so egregious that means that even if they get some bad legislation through, they don't get the worst possible form of it. It could look like imprisonment of political opponents. Could you imagine what the Russian government would do if it could just appoint technocrats? Oh wait, it already does that, right? I think that to the extent that that is true, and to the extent that you have significant corruption in government, it is far amplified on their side of the house. To the extent that we talk about countries that have freer democracies, their harms also accrue, because in that case, the principle becomes most relevant. At this point, I'll take a point from CG if you have one.
Under your side, technocrats learn the problems with things like predictive policing and have clear analyses on them, as opposed to having a broad generic discussion that politicians currently have, which is, we don't trust those kinds of people. Why don't we have more trackers on them? Which might make sense on face to the racists.
To be clear, policy advisors already exist. You know whether policies make sense or not. That's just called common sense. Like, people still have economics degrees who work for government. That's what the civil service is. The question is whether you should circumvent democratic procedures to implement policies that you otherwise would not implement. That is a question in this debate, not some airy-fairy conception of whether you think people get more or less racist. But on that, you get fewer checks on your side of the house. First, because you insulate these technocrats from criticism. They're not on the firing line and they're not elected representatives, meaning that there's no clear channel by which they can be replaced. They can always argue that their policy is utilitarian or appeals to the majority. And to the extent that that is true, they're significantly more majoritarian. Firstly, because they're liable to the political interests of the politician, presumably at the very top of power, meaning that they're more likely to side with whatever it is that they want to do. But secondly, in order to like pass the legislation that they want, they would have to be hugely majoritarian to the point where they don't support things that are progressive. For example, same-sex marriage took forever in Australia because our high court is super regressive. Think of the people in academia, like a bunch of them are old white men. How much progressive policy do you really think that they're going to be passing, particularly in countries where like getting minorities into university is a problem in and of itself? Secondly, though, I think checks on politicians are just fundamentally reduced because you offload the burden to the technocrats. Finally, you get worse policy because it is indistinguishable from policy that you think that, like, it is mostly like passed off or marketed as indistinguishable from otherwise good policy, but you have no real comparative, because when you're fed the idea that an expert told you to do a particular thing, you're going to say that, oh, it is good that they did a particular thing because they're an elite expert and maybe they know what they're talking about. In reality, most of the time they don't. We're so incredibly proud to oppose this motion.
Thank you very much to Ella. It's time for DPM to continue.
Prefer POIs in chat, but if I haven't responded by 5:30, feel free to just unmute and say, and I'll take CO. A few top-down responses before I go into the two main clashes in this round. It's just terrible debating for UU to have their cake and eat it too when they say, look, facts exist on our side too. Yes, they do, but there's a difference as to how much they're taking into consideration, and there's a huge difference between bureaucrats who have the ability to advise politicians who are still motivated by their desire to become elected again, or their desire to appeal to their specific voter bases, and the fact that technocrats on our side, the same bureaucrats which you think are great because they knew the facts, are able to actually have decision-making abilities. I also think it's ridiculous for them to say, the harm of bureaucrats is that oftentimes they're swayed by the opinions of the government, and therefore they're majoritarian. Yeah, they're majoritarian to some extent if you live in an incredibly corrupt democracy, corrupt government, where the government's not going to leave the technocrats alone, but it's still significantly better than directly being voted into by the population at large, because that is just all your harms of majoritarianism without at least the shield of having an independent body. The second observation I want to make is just how uncomparative a lot of their claims are, right? Because listing bad ideas and attributing them towards technocrats is not argumentation, insofar as I can just fling them right back at them and be like, oh, here are some bad decisions that governments have made as well. I think that the very example that they bring up of broken windows policing is actually a perfect example for technocrats are so much better than executive governments, right? Because yeah, they were forwarded by academia, because most cutting edge ideas are formulated by academics who have a better grasp of knowledge than everyone else in the field. The difference, though, is that this was forwarded by a small, minor, radical field of extremists and became defunct and rejected by the vast majority of people in criminal justice academia very quickly after it became mainstream. The reason it was implemented is because conservative politicians who decided that this fit their ideology and was very convenient towards getting reelected decided to push it through in order to further their own interests anyways. The reason that they're claimed that research technocracy is bad because research is just completely alienated from people is ridiculous, because we no longer live in ancient Greece where the process of science is just theologians thinking within their ivory towers. Definitionally, technocrats who work in criminal justice need to know how criminal justice works, how policies have been implemented on the ground, and whether or not they have worked or succeeded. I think that when you perceive that something is horrible and terrible idea, you can very quickly then roll it back in a way that a politician who wants to save face and therefore doesn't want to backtrack can't. For all those reasons, I think that it's just unfair for them to try and have their cake and eat it too. Now onto two of the before that, sure, Ron.
Just out of curiosity, would you limit this to criminal justice policy, or do you also think it would be a good idea to replace every single other ministry of governance with technocrats too?
Very nice. So this leads me actually exactly to the accountability clash, because I explain what makes criminal justice different from every other branch of government, which means that it uniquely needs to be governed by technocrats. So in short, it's because, look, the criminal justice system disproportionately affects a small number of people, especially minorities who have less power, and therefore it's illegitimate for the majority to decide on their behalf because the vast majority of people are not victims of criminal justice in the same way that a small group of people are. Okay, so why are technocrats better in general? The first is because I would just posit that even though, like, Nicole just assumes on face that because they're elected politicians that they're represented is just not true, because lots of elected people are not representative of people, right? One, because most democratic systems, elections are slightly fucked up. Gerrymandering is a huge thing in the USA with the electoral college system, and like there are all sorts of things that go wrong. Even in their best case scenario, where the electoral system is absolutely perfect and flows seamlessly, we still have problems because voting is disproportionate and doesn't reflect people on the ground. Because people who are older, whiter, have more money, are way more able to turn out and vote from the streets. There are vast swathes of every population which are actively disenfranchised and prevented from going out onto the voting booths. And this is especially bad when it comes to the criminal justice system, because these often correspond directly to those who are targeted by the criminal justice system. I also just want to be very, very clear, right? An example of this is just not everyone has the right to vote. Not everyone has the right to weigh in on criminal justice systems equally. The reason for this is because I think that social contract arguments generally suck, because the idea of the state is fabricated. It's like an arbitrary border that we draw for the sake of convenience. It's not the case because most people in a society decide that this is probably right, that it is right. I think it's possible to determine objective morality to some extent. For example, even if like 50 people in the room in a nation of like 50 decided that the punishment for stealing should be beheading, it's still probably deeply immoral because it causes a disproportionate amount of harm and suffering is just on net bad. And the purpose of the criminal justice system is just to minimize suffering, minimize discord in society. Another more realistic example is just like countries like Indonesia, where the punishment for blasphemy would be, according to like 60% of the population, to be stoned to death. I think that having the majority should not be allowed to dictate punishments because they're often vindictive, because they want to hurt, and because they themselves know they never have to suffer the consequences of the criminal justice system. That's why we should protect individual vulnerable people over the idea of majoritarian rule. Here's a counterfactual as to why technocrats are such good actors and also uniquely likely to act in progressive ways. They're good actors for like a fuck ton of ways that Nicole never responded to, right? One, they're held accountable according to facts and figures, and because they have a duty to maximize the goals that they were set there to accomplish, i.e. to maximize rehabilitation, for example, to prevent recidivism, all of these good goals that can be generally objectively measured by things such as surveys, statistics. But second of all, because they're just more educated and therefore more sympathetic to victims, very simply because they know about the structures which govern people's decisions and force some people into lives of crime, as opposed to being like, I never had to commit crime, therefore I'm better than this other human being who's a dirty criminal who deserves to go to jail. But third, we just get the possibility for passing policies, right? Their best case scenario is a world where politicians are also progressive. But the problem is on their side, you have gridlock, as they themselves say, because people block policies that would make lives better just because their followers care more that they're in opposition towards another politician who they dislike than not getting the policy passed in the first place. Politicizing things and just interpreting things as whether they're morally right or wrong, or whether they're constitutional, for example, as the Supreme Court does, means they get to pass policies much faster. Finally, they're just they're in government for a longer period of time, which means that they can pass long-term policy reform, as opposed to the mobility that O celebrates, but just leads to lots of flip-flopping in terms of the stance that the decisors have, and therefore never get any change. Finally, just why they're more progressive, right? I just think that the one response we got was that, technocrats are old. Yeah, politicians are old too. The reason for this is just because they've spent long enough in power to further their career. The difference is, though, that old politicians often are elected because they represent the conservative, like older generation that voted in the diplomat office, whereas technocrats often are highly educated and therefore are more up-to-date, more progressive, as it were. Finally, why is this the most important issue in the round? One, because there's an incredible human cost when you allow criminal justice to be captured by political incentives, and second of all, because in their best case scenario, progress is slow at a huge human cost. For all those reasons, please vote Open and Government's clear win today. Thanks.
Thank you very much to the PM, and it's time for DLO to close the debate on the top half. Here.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, all good.
Yep. Anyway, POIs in chat, please. I think it's impossible for opening government to simultaneously claim that technocrats are accountable because they have to produce specific results, but also say that they're guaranteed their roles and thus, are able to implement long-term policy. There's no way that these two things can be true. But even independent of this, it's not necessarily clear to me the characterization of technocrats we get is actually accurate. What I'm going to do is a couple of things. Firstly, I'm going to tell you how technocrats are selected, why they're not necessarily worse in the best case, and also, I think, substantially worse in the worst case. Secondly, talk about how this influences criminal justice policy and sort of other kinds of policies. And thirdly, the accountability clash, why I think that's winning as well. The first question I want to ask is, how do you select the technocrats, right? Because presumably the idea of most governments is that you select technocrats based on, whatever the party in power is, right? The problem with this, however, is that we get this vision that technocrats are, on professors, for example, are on balance more progressive, or on balance more enlightened about things. That may be true, but the subset of people who are willing to be nominated to these roles is probably not nearly as representative as they think it is, right? For the precise reasons that the CIA loves the professors that are enhanced interrogation and waterboarding are great, presumably these are the same kinds of people you're likely to nominate on their side of the house as well. What is the difference then in the ways that you nominate in these individuals? One, the terms simply last substantially longer. That is, even if you were nominated through a democratic process, or whether or not you're nominated like a cabinet member is in the United States, for example, you still are subject to these sort of political winds that exist right now. The only difference is that you're not subject to changes in those opinions, typically in the more progressive direction, because that's usually the way public opinion moves, right? But the second lead problem with this is that you're not necessarily likely to be representative, and if anything, these sort of things that you're likely to believe in are things that are stuck substantially in the past. I want to be very, very clear here. The misconception from opening government is that people's opinions tend to move far more slowly than academic opinions. This is something I actually don't necessarily agree with, right? Because the simple truth of the matter is that the vast majority of super conservative individuals, like super pro-crime individuals are telling you about, are simply not individuals who vote solely based on crime, but the people who are in favor of criminal justice reform are single issue voters, which means the policy change actually, I think, happens faster on our side. Two questions. One, who gets better criminal justice policy? Two, how does this interact with sort of broader societal questions of accountability? First thing I want to ask is, who gets better criminal justice policy? I want to be very clear. Opening government's best case is a world where you nominate individuals who are sort of representative of the broader political leanings of the individuals who have appointed them or have nominated them. This means that their best case is a world in which individuals are largely reflective of the opinions already happen in the status quo. The only difference is that you're not able to repeal those fucking laws because now they're no longer accountable to the democratic populace. The assertion that we get is that people are more progressive, or they know more, or they have more exposure to these ideologies, but this is an assertion about professors in general, not about the kinds of individuals who are likely to be nominated to these positions, which is the key distinction that I think they've missed. The second part of this, though, is that to the extent that you're going to get bad policies either way, because academics fuck up a lot, like the Chicago boys totally fucked up Latin America, and it's not necessarily something, and even if they're able to access, some sort of smaller probability here, these policies are substantially more difficult to reverse. Why? In the status quo, there are large numbers of people who are substantially motivated to do things like take down bad criminal justice system. This is the reason why we see criminal justice social movements right now of individuals who are single issue voters about the idea that you ought to cause criminal justice reform. On their side, however, even if you're able to nominate nominally more progressive people in 10 or 20 years when the terms run out, it's not clear that this moves nearly as fast as the policies we're seeing right now. To be clear, in either world, you're going to get bad policies like broken windows policing because the individuals who are appointing them share those political priorities. The only difference is, are you able to expel these people if public opinion shifts as it has right now, and it has, I think, we are seeing in the status quo. The second thing I want to say here under this, though, which is something I don't think opening up government engages with appropriately, is that the fact that you allow technocrats to have control rather than the populace eliminates the incentives for individuals to critically engage with this sort of policy, because you told them that they don't have the ability to select what kinds of policy gets made, i.e. these sorts of social movements that you see against criminal justice are no longer nearly as efficacious or nearly as existent because people have no incentive to join movements that they know cannot make real policy change and that might only be effective in 20 years, which means even in their best case scenario, you will get rid of the mechanisms by which people are able to pressure governments, and the sort of pressure you get is predominantly anti-tough on crime policies, not pro-tough on crime policies. Second thing I want to talk a sub-point under this I want to talk about is quickly about how the policies are likely to look like. But before that, I will take OG.
We support an EU model where technocrats are selected by a body of their peers according to their accomplishments, but even if we had to defend Trump nominating freaking Kavanaugh was willing to block Trump's protests about the election, whereas Cruz and McConnell and other politicians aren't.
Wait, it's not clear to me that your model actually does any from this. I also don't think this model is at all specified, really. But like even in your scenario, presumably the selection of individuals that select these sort of peers are still, politically linked, right? Like otherwise, I think that like there's like you would also have to defend a world where you just make all these policies according to technocrats, which is something that CEO pointed out, right? So it's not clear to me that this is necessarily the case. Second question I want to talk about is even in their best case where technocrats know exactly the policies that they need to do to minimize crime, why does this actually still not work? Why? Because the way in which you act is one in which you want to decrease crime overall, but we think that this comes at the expense of other more important things. The reason the democratic principle is important is not because of the social contract layering of it, but because of the idea that there are other things that are more important than the utilitarian calculus of reducing crime, i.e. it is pragmatically beneficial to like shit all over the Fourth Amendment that bans unreasonable searches because you would catch far more criminals that way and diminish crime a significant amount. It's probably bad because you think that individuals have a minimum expectation of privacy that is far more important of their ability to engage in democratic society. The problem with technocrats is not that they don't know a lot about their fields, is that they don't know the way in which their fields interact with things that are not their fields. That's why they're technocrats in the first place. So their best case scenario is a world in which you reduce crimes. We think this comes at the expense of things like civil liberties, things that people are really, really wedded to, but that technocrats on balance are more willing to compromise, specifically because of the idea that they're not accountable to individuals. Finally, I want to talk about the way that the accountability clash about what happens in a world where these individuals are wrong. How do you correct this? Firstly, the really simple argument here is just that, like the fact that you can't be voted out just means that you're not likely to enact more pro-crime policies. But secondly, it's not necessarily clear to me that academics are at all willing to revise their position substantially in light of new evidence, which is the argument they've given you. That is, the same people who supported broken windows policing back in the 80s are the exact same individuals who are supporting broken windows policing right now. The stances of the individuals haven't changed. And for all of OG's protestations that these individuals are substantial minorities of academic communities, it remains true that these are the kinds of people you appointed to the fucking policy advisor positions. Why aren't they the same individuals you put in the literal positions of power instead? There's an easy intuition pump here, which is the idea of why you don't let, for example, judges make the laws, or you don't let random individuals who know a lot of information about legal history determine criminal justice policy. It's not that they don't know very basic common sense changes that are likely going to happen in the long run. It's that the sacrifices that they make along the way and the ability to make up their mistakes is just substantially less likely to occur. We're willing to bite the idea that on occasion society makes large mistakes that cause detriment to large numbers of people. The question is that I think these things are likely to last a shorter amount of time and are likely to be accountable to at least minimum standards of things like civil liberties that I think are thoroughly given up on government.
Thank you very much to the yellow and
Sorry, well, bear with me 1 second.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, all right, 1 second. Timer. All right, 3, 2, 1. I want to make several observations. Firstly, about the nature of government, and then secondly, about the debate thus far. The first is I think it's really worth pointing out, and I cannot stress the importance enough of this, is that criminal justice policy is a very narrow slice of an enormous vertical cross-section of government. It is one arm of an enormously complicated machine which governs every aspect of our lives. This will become, well, I'll tell you now early on why it's relevant, because crime is driven by structural factors. And when at the point at which you remove from the political process only one aspect of that, you do not solve the structural factors and you do not solve the secondary factors that otherwise would correct crime later on. I'll explain that in more detail later. The second is, I think opening opposition, while they, did the classic thing of let's say every possible thing that can possibly be said on our side of the motion and hope that some of it sticks, unfortunately did not go into a lot of depth on a lot of it. But more critically, I think they were entirely uncharitable to the conception from the government bench of what technocrats are. So I'm going to take government at their best. I'm going to say, you know what? Even if these people are genuinely experts, even if they are informed, even if they're not ideologues, and even if they're guided by data, and even if they update their views based upon that data, why that will still not work, and why advisors are comparatively better, but in a more nuanced way. Let's get into that. Firstly, and this is a really important observation to make about every single field of academic study, there is never a consensus within any study of academic field. Let me give you a couple of different examples of disputes that exist within the field of social sciences, which is fundamentally what criminology is. Don't believe the government when they tell you that this is something that we can work out as an objective truth, because it's not a machine. It is a vast interconnected system of individuals, each governed by emotions, each governed by chaotic circumstances, each individually distinct and different. It's not something that you can boil down into an equation. Right? So what that means, therefore, is one of the first splits that even exists within the fields of social science academia is whether or not we ought be relying on data in the first place versus relying upon it, like first principles reasoning. If you want an example of where this has occurred within the context of criminal justice policy, it is historically criminologists looked at the fact that crime rates were disproportionately higher amongst African Americans in America, in the USA, for example, and stated, okay, well, we need to be more harsh on them, right? That was a data-driven approach. It was only when the critical race theorists came in who said, you cannot look at that because that hides and the data obscures the prior factors. Instead, we ought to consider the underlying rationale, independent of any sort of scientific analysis, that it causes this heightened level of criminality. Now, the point I'm not making here is not that either one of these groups is right in all instances. It's that there is a genuine disagreement in all instances, right? Why is this important? Because when you have advisors, and what this boils down to, actually, I just want to clarify this a little bit further, is that what this means is that you often end up with different policies, each of which are successful, but they are successful on their own criteria and on their own metrics. So let me use an analogous area, which is quite familiar to me, right? Economics. Is an economic policy better, i.e. more preferable to pursue on an objective basis, if it maximizes the net size of the economy or if it reduces inequality? Neither of those things is objectively better. Both of them affect different people to a different extent. So equally, is a criminal justice policy objectively better if it minimizes the net harm to a vulnerable group, which are numerically small, or if it reduces incidences of crime against a much larger group of people that is not vulnerable? There is no clear answer to that question that can be answered through a scientific lens, through a technical lens, because that is a philosophical question. Why is this important? Because politicians, at the point at which they have advisors, do not have a single advisor. It's not a question of whether they listen to them or not. It's not a question of who knows more. The question you ought to be asking is how many different perspectives are they introduced to? So what happens in the status quo is that the politicians turn to the civil servants who have some experience dealing with the data that the government collects. They turn to a different set of academics and say, what is your perspective on this? They turn to a third group of academics, maybe the private sector, think tanks. There's numerous influences, but the point is, what they are all feeding is saying this policy on this basis of evidence will produce this outcome. And at the end of the day, you have a plethora of different outcomes, each which produces different goods on the basis of what it is that you prioritize. The way then that you adjudicate between that is on the basis of what matters to people on a principle basis. And if society collectively prefers one outcome, it doesn't matter if the academics think that objectively in data-driven approach, that is not the one that we should pursue. That is the role of politicians, and that is the fundamental principle basis of representative democracy. It is about adjudicating between different priorities, not about maximizing any particular outcome, right? So why is this all important? Well, the first one, as I said, is it's important because it's a philosophical exercise and therefore can only be fairly done through the lens of the democratic system, because that represents and reflects people's preferences. The second one, and the majority of them, I don't care if, there is disagreements on this, the majority of people will always be right because there is more of them and they are the ones being affected by this. To say that it disproportionately harms a minority group of people is fine if they could even prove that, which I don't think they have. I'll come back to that in a little bit. The second thing is, and this is critical, if proposed policies are identical to what the technocrats want, then there's no need for this debate to happen. Politicians would already be doing it, right? But they are often not. Often the technocrats have a particular conception of criminal justice that the politicians don't agree with. That's something they have to bite the bullet on accepting. Why is that problematic? Because, as I said, government is enormously complicated. If the politicians have the power stripped away from them to actually enact criminal justice policy that's politically popular, they will do so. They will wash their hands of that quite publicly. The problem is then you don't have the political capital, i.e. the ability to literally pass bills for funding for things like reducing economic inequality or economic impoverishment or just like malnutrition at an early age. You lose the ability to fix dysfunctional education systems. You lose the ability to increase funding for like things like mental health. That's all before crime has even occurred. Now let's look at the instances after. Government reliance upon this idea of rehabilitation producing better outcomes. Rehabilitation requires massive sustained funding of social services. If politicians are now no longer tied to this decision that is unpopular, there's no reason for them to support the necessary structures that exist around that particular policy. There's no reason for them to improve those other things because those other things are not part of their policy agenda and they don't agree with the core program of rehabilitation in the first place. They will wash their hands of it and they will not pursue it. So when I always tell you that you lose the impetus to campaign for these things, not only is that true, but it's actually far more pernicious than that. You don't even have the groups of people that would otherwise be making the arguments for these cases, making them to the public. You don't have academics needing to go through the process of convincing the public that rehabilitation is a good idea and they should be employing felons and that they should be giving people a second chance because they're already in the position to enact that policy. But they can't succeed in enacting that policy without the political support a priori, and now that is lost. So we don't get to fix these problems in the long run. The last observation I want to make here is the likely outcome of this, and this is where I'm going to decrease my charitability towards the government. Because in those different groups, the ones that will be picked and the ones whose metrics will be prioritized will be those who have access to politicians and the networking effects to get into these positions of technocracy in the first place. And those are going to be the people who are more economically and socially privileged and have the ability to get into the halls of power and convince politicians that their particular conception of what is important in criminal justice is the one that ought to be chosen. That is why you absolutely must, and that's why you can't apply it to every other system of government, because this problem applies symmetrically in all countries, in all instances, and in all spheres of policy. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. And it's time for summary speeches, starting with the government whip.
Awesome. Cool. I'd like to that if that's okay. Three, two, one. Team by team, I don't have anything else sexy to do here. Let's start with CO. First, I'm going to note a few things about the CO extension. I think they're pretty typical of a lot of things that happen in debates, but I need to be very clear about them. The first thing Ron does wrong is that he doesn't take a POI. That's cool. The second thing, and the more meaningful thing that Ron does wrong, is that he lets the perfect get in the way of the good. That is to say, I want to talk about his first idea of the extension, about how there is never consensus around academic things. I want to be clear here. There's consensus around a lot of academic things that don't exist in the political sphere. Climate scientists think climate change is bad, and a lot of politicians, especially conservatives, don't believe this. Second, people think that trickle-down economics and the Chicago boys are bad, which is something that the OO literally talks about. Broken windows and mandatory minimum policies are things that the overwhelming consensus of experts all agree are wrong. I also want to be clear here that the metric here is pretty unambiguous. That is to say, we've proved that it probably is important that you literally don't have police shootings existing, that you probably don't have offenders. I don't think the metrics are all that difficult here. Ron says, oh, but for example, criminology didn't really think about things until critical race theory changed the game. The problem is he's not being, that is to say, yeah, CRT did change the game, but in status quo, conservatives still don't incorporate that, whereas you literally have to incorporate it into your scholarship to be considered a respected scholar. Why is this important? Second thing that Ron actually messes up here is that he's not very comparative. Let's respond to the idea about how advisors are fundamentally better about the extension. Few reasons why this is wrong. First, I want to deal with why you actually don't get many perspectives for politicians at their side of the house. That is to say, it's probably really likely that the vast majority of people have one person they believe on any given topic. That is to say, even if you have a lot of advisors, you probably have one who's going to be focused on legal issues, one who's going to be focused on economic issues. This is particularly true if you run cabinet positions. I don't think you're going to go beyond the attorney general for criminology stuff. But secondly, I think academics are structurally incentivized to actually engage opposition thought. This is the most important thing, right? If you want to become a technocrat, if you want to get a PhD, if you want to be considered respected, you literally have to engage with opposite opinions on their side of the house. You have to do this through footnotes, through literature reviews, through actually reckoning with essential clashes in your field in order to become prominent enough to be appointed a technocrat. Why is this so important? It is literally the only way to be relevant for technocrats. You don't have to do this on their side of the house when you have political advisors. The third and probably most important response to this is that in their world, they are never going to appoint someone who disagrees with what the vast majority of people actually agree with in your constituency. That is to say, a rural area, very conservative. And so if I'm liberal, regardless if I'm the most qualified person to advise my senator, they're never going to pick me because I'm going to be in opposition to them. The advisors that politicians pick will always be people who confirm their biases because one, it is easier to confirm things to yourself, and secondly, you just don't want to pick a fucking fight. I think at this point we proved to you why advisors are far worse to actually pick on their side of the house. You actually pick people who just listen to you, who don't actually do really meaningful things. Pond says that the last part of the extension is that technocrats diverge from politicians, and this is really bad because politicians wash the hands of criminal justice. First, I think this is a little bit uncharitable at the very least, insofar as I think if you give discretion to technocrats, they probably have a bit of ability to adjust a few things. Like, for example, the chair of the Federal Reserve can decide where the money goes without the president saying anything. The Secretary of Education can decide how much money you're going to put into public schools as opposed to private school charters and things like that. I think at that point you kind of divergence. But thirdly, this just isn't fundamentally all that comparative insofar as politicians don't get criticized right now beyond liberals. I'm going to talk about our extension and why it's really a shame that they didn't respond to it and why you should discount responses that come now that we don't have a chance to respond to them. But first I'll take a POI from opening. What's up, Justin?
Yeah, so both opening and closing opposition have given you reasons why even if people aren't popular, they'll still be selected anyway. So why isn't that still true on your side?
Right. Even if they are not popular, they will be selected anyway. This might be true, but there is a certain degree of comparativeness that is missing from op case. That is to say, even if it is you don't pick the number one person in a field, you probably have to pick someone who has a PhD, who's had to engage with these kinds of things. I think this is really important, but I'm going to talk about why our extension beats this anyway on our side of the house. First, I'm just going to weigh us against our opening really quickly because I think this is important to get out of the way now. Opening does a few things. They talk about why technocrats are going to listen to other people because they have things like statistics and empathy, and they're in government for longer. They say that technocrats are good, politicians are polarized. Why do them? We're the ones who meaningfully explain to you the comparative along two axes. First, we tell you that the status quo is really shit insofar as the only person you could look to as criminal authorities right now are cops who are literally incentivized to prove to you that life is a fucking nightmare, and if you don't criminalize and put more people in prison, then you're going to die tomorrow. Second, we talk to you about liberal politicians and why they will never push popular policy on criminal justice because first, it is mad unpopular, and second, it leaves them open to an existential threat on our side of the house that you end up losing ability to vote, or that you lose your ability to get reelected. Third, because liberal politicians will never fight this battle because the people they'd be helping are systematically disenfranchised. This is why, for example, we explain why the comparative is better. Note that this is what proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that you don't get meaningful op change. That is to say, electoral politics is specifically bad for criminal justice because on their side of the house, even when liberals are in power, you never actually get change because the liberals will never pick this battle. On our side of the house, even in their best case on op, if you end up having harms through conservatives and conservatives appoint the shittiest people alive, that's fine. That's status quo for the op. On our side of the house, when you appoint good people, when you have that moderate Democrat, when you have people who are more progressive, they do get good people. This is literally the only times you get progressive policy, and it only happens through the mechanisms that we give you on closing government. I think that this weighs really importantly in our round. What do we do here? I'm going to talk about opening opposition really quickly here. I've already explained to you why policy advisors exist, which is something that OG doesn't respond to. Is not really as good of an argument as they think of when I was responding to closing opposition. I've explained to you why electoral politics is always worse for criminal justice specifically because of the salience of criminal justice. That is to say, it's seen as an existential threat. White voters do respond to the idea of super predators. It is why this racial rhetoric is so salient. And we explained to you why politicians will never actually try to change criminal justice because it is such a dangerous game. This is why, even though Black Lives Matter advocates are marching on the streets of New York every day to this fucking day, Bill de Blasio, the New York Democratic mayor, won't do shit about it because he's scared he's going to lose office. And this happens across the country, across the world, even in the greatest call for Black lives in the history of the fucking country. We tell you that vulnerability to political influence doesn't work as an opening opposition argument or a closing opposition argument, probably for the reasons that OG gave you. That's fine. We tell you that there is at least more political influence on their side of the house. You should weigh, even if you don't believe any of that, you should weigh getting people out of jail as highest possible. Because first, prison is literally destroys lives. It leads to recidivism. It leads to losing your job, losing your family, losing the liberty of the state. We explain to you why at least some of the time we get better results. They don't. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much. And it's time for the last speech of this debate and for the in-rounds of Doxbridge Worlds for you. Upward.
Sorry, I was yawning. Can you hear me? Yeah, cool. PYs in the chat, type in your team code. I'll fish one out at a time in the speech. In a minute, I'll be like 10-9 and then like leave some space. And then when I start speaking is when it'll begin. But that'll give you an idea of where it's going to be. 10, 9. So, Ron brings you, 1, there's no right answer to most criminal justice problems, and we should let politicians choose which outcomes we should prioritize because it's society's choice, and any other option is just randomly picking one of those options over the other because there aren't right ones between them. 2, you can't just solve criminal justice issues with policies in criminal justice alone because it's part of a much bigger system of complex issues, and therefore you need to address the whole thing so it doesn't get into the solutions they want. Those 2 things undercut the whole debate because it means the best case scenario for Gov is that they get close, that they would get closer to ideal policies. But if those ideal policies don't exist, then they lose their benefit. And if they can't solve the problems, or the chance that they solve them is very low, then what we should prioritize is what we can defend, which is the preferences that people have and representing those in society and representing the control people should have over their own lives and the systems of law that govern their lives. And note this is particularly important in the context of criminal justice because you are deciding what is criminal, what is not, how that is handled and how that is dealt with. And so it is incredibly important you have control over that for the reasons Ron tells you, that your preferences matter, that they're important. Responses to closing government. And then I'm going to go into dealing with a little bit more of this in detail. They say there's consensus among academics in lots of cases. First off, concession, there's not in lots of others. But no, where there's consensus in academia, there is also usually consensus in politics. They rely here on the asserted example about climate, which is that politicians don't think climate exists. Note 2 things, very, very few say that anymore. 2, those who do base it on research from academia and the handful of studies that disagree using science. But we can actually hold them to account on our side when it comes from a politician rather than the academic, because you can't rebut the academic if you don't have the science because it's perceived as technocratically correct. That's the response to CG, which was implicit in Ron's speech, but weird that they think we can't do rebuttal in the whip for some reason. They then tell us the example of police shooting, but look, that evidence actually does disagree here. The science of herd mentality and behavior is often used to justify extreme gun policies. They also concede that technocrats have an incentive on their side to appeal to politicians. Note that's exactly what Ron tells you is the reason why evidence develops to support different political agendas. People have different political backgrounds and appeal to them through research. It's the systematic reason why, symmetrically, they are likely to have these bodies of evidence on either side, but it's why they can't get to objective truth. But it's not just accountability, it's also people's trust. Police shootings, it's a perfect example of the decay of trust, because if police feel like ivory tower academics are ignoring the reality of crime, they will take on the role of protecting the public in their own hand, and that gets much, much worse because they are much more brutal. Yes, the politicians might prioritize advisors who align with their politics. That's literally the point of Ron's extension. The public chooses what metrics matter to them and find advisors to prioritize what is the thing that they were elected to do, whether it is reducing injustice or reducing crime. The next response is that they deserve more flexibility on what criminal justice, controlling funding, and control over the police, and a huge number of other things that are, by definition, not criminal justice. They relied on so many more things to get what they wanted to talk about. There is a world outside the USA, not everyone elects a string of conservative governments, and even then, the previous US president engaged in a massive program of liberalizing criminal justice under Obama. Finally, the Chicago boys were advisors, academic advisors to Reagan. That's kind of the point. Don't know why they didn't get that. OG.
You're pushing a false comparative. Nobody has perfect decisions, but technocrats are much better able to balance these interests, whereas politicians or police chiefs are directly representing majoritarian preferences with their tough on crime stuff.
I'm afraid that's not helping you because you're missing the point. The point is your side relies on there being perfect decision-making because your goal is to represent perfect decision-making. Our side relies on there not being perfect decision-making to the extent that lots of people have different views, and therefore we let society choose through elections how to govern the system that controls their lives. So it's not a false comparative, and it's not fair to say, oh, well, there's imperfect decision-making on either side. We acknowledge that. We acknowledge there are no correct decisions. It's not possible to make them. That's the point. That's why we default back to politics as the means to adjudicate it. So it's not a false comparative. It's the comparative, and it's problematic for you. So why are there no ideal policies in criminal justice? Note their burden was efficacy because they are seeking efficacy through technocracy. It's the entire premise of the case. So they need to show that they can get more stuff like that. Even the best policy, we say, won't work in every case. That deals with the highest burden of OG's funny characterization that this is perfect policies in every case. Because, one, they're only changing one aspect of the complex systems of government. It doesn't mean resources and secondary structures will exist to accommodate this. It's especially true if, in the example Gov rely on, like racial equality, because they don't get fiat to solve racism in people's brains. They just change criminal justice policies. But also in those examples, the elite technocrats are likely to be the people least likely to be liberally and equality minded. They tend to be the elites doing the oppression. That's why if you look at the policing policy world, in the real world, the ones that are driven by data are racial profiling, because that's what the data says works, rather than the community policing that they say that exists for which has very little data. Systematic for two reasons. One, to the extent that opening government want innovative changes that haven't happened anywhere else before, there's obviously no data for that because it hasn't been done before. Two, there's lots of data from across history, so it's very easy to just make a choice and claim it was justified by data. That doesn't mean choices are any less personal or biased. It can just be hidden behind data without scrutiny. So at this point, technocrats are less accountable. There's a very high chance that they are also racist. But you can't call them out for being racist because it's not a political choice. It's seen as the right technical thing. It absolves them of any discussion. Politicians in their world don't have a reason to discuss it because they just blame the experts for doing it. There's no reason to bring it into the light. If politicians are making the decision, they need to justify it to their voters rather than just saying we're doing it because the smart people told us to do it. And therefore, you actually get some level of the discussion of the kind CG wants. In the very least, you get a conversation you can push back on. Their world, no conversation. Politicians don't talk. Technocrats don't have a platform, and therefore doesn't happen. Principle of justice. I think we can fill this in for opening opposition. They give us societies have no moral codes of states because they're individuals. Crimes happen against individual people, and it's good to represent people's preferences. Should be clear that's not a complete principle for two reasons. I'll pull out what Ron told you about this because it was all mixed up in the middle of his practical points, but it fixes the principle, so I think we can win on this also. First, it relies on which side has more accountability for the public without engaging in the debate on which is more accountable, technocrats or politicians, and that's especially important because there's no analysis on the comparative advisors and why it doesn't create problems that they discuss as well. CG assert people want outcomes, but note they also care about processes. It's why people want more organ donations but don't support kidnapping all the homeless people and stealing their organs to do it. So it's fair to let people have a preference on how something is done and not just the outcomes. Ron says, ultimately, there exist trade-offs founded on principles and criminal justice policy. Having a spectrum of advisors means politicians can weigh that off. The fact we preserve the final decision with politicians who represent people is why our side can fulfill that principle. So we fill this hole in, and it's why we deal with CG's response here as well, because it is about who has the final decision. It's not just about both of them existing. You'll notice when we get into this weird part of the debate, the comparative is very small because you'll go like, oh, there are politicians and there are also advisors on both sides. The point is, who gets the final decision? Do we say the technocrats listen to all the political views and make a decision about which is right, which is impossible because there is no right decision? Or do we say the technocrats say all of the evidence and politicians prioritize which matters more for people? That's weaponizing the principal work opening opposition did in a very shallow way with what Ron told you about it. It's why it makes it effective. It's why it shows that on a very simple level, the way up is very hard to get any of the benefits they want, but we can preserve preferences. Give us the win because we weren't sure.
Thanks, everyone. The good news is you can rest imminently, but you can wait for a break somewhere else, not in this call. Thank you so much. Have fun. Grab some drink. Here you see you later.
Thank you.
Admin and stream also. Bye-bye.